In this video, we're going to compare the similarities between ancient Greek and ancient Maya civilization. Now, most of my career has been in the Maya area, but this last summer, I took a trip in and around Greece, and I found some fascinating things that I didn't know were so similar between the two cultures. So, there were a lot of them, but I'm going to give you just 5 of them here. Number 1 is limestone. Every building in the Maya area, save a very few on the fringes, are made out of limestone blocks. And as I traveled around ancient Greece, I discovered they too used primarily limestone for their buildings. Now, I have to admit that I was ignorant there. I kind of assumed that ancient Greece always used marble. And they did use marble. They used it for statues and for columns. But the bulk of the buildings are actually limestone. So that's number 1 that the Maya and the Greeks share in common, using limestone as their primary construction material. Number 2 is related to construction. It's the Corbel arch. Some people call the Corbel arch the false arch, indicating that they think that the keystone arch is the superior arch, the one with the big keystone on top, and then the stones counterbalance each other as they go down the arch. Well, the Maya's main way of making arches was the Corbel arch, which kind of looks like a upside-down staircase. The stones poke out a little bit more till a capstone. So it wasn't a keystone, it was a capstone, and the weight of the capstone keeps everything together. That's the way the Maya did it. Now, I had read about it before, but I had never seen it with my own eyes, that the early Greek buildings also used the Corbel arch, and they almost never used the keystone arch, only at the very end of Greek civilization, where they were actually in contact with Roman civilization, did they start making that arch. But I saw a number of interesting examples. The best are at Mycenae, where we have first the Lion's Gate, which is a really classic example of Corbel arch, but then also what they call either the Tomb of Agamemnon or the Treasury of Atreus. That's an interesting one because it's what's called a tholos. It's kind of a dome shape. But if you look carefully at the architecture of that dome, it is also Corbel arch technology. Each one of the stones are poking out a little bit all the way around the dome, and then there's a cap on top. So I saw that in Mycenae. I also saw Corbel arches in Knossos on Crete. That's even earlier than the Mycenaean civilization, and they too were using these tholos tombs, and the construction was Corbel arch. Now, of course, as Greek civilization went on, they came to prefer those columns with the beams on top. We call that pole and lintel construction. But in the early days of Greece, they were just like the Maya, using Corbel arches. Number 3 is the use of obsidian as a source of material to make tools and art out of. Now, I really didn't think about obsidian because everything you read about the Greeks is all about bronze. They lived in the Bronze Age and before the Iron Age. But they also lived before the Bronze Age. And during that period, they were using obsidian as their main tool material. Even after the Bronze Age had really begun, the Greeks were still using obsidian for tools. The reason is that obsidian is incredibly sharp. It can be much, much sharper of an implement than anything made out of bronze. Now, another really interesting thing about the comparison of the Maya and the Greek use of obsidian is how they made their obsidian blades, the really simple blades for just everyday use. Now, in the Maya world, they take a block of obsidian, like a nodule, and they shape it into a kind of flat-topped, almost apple-looking shape. And when it's exhausted, we call it an exhausted core because it looks like a core of an apple. Now I happen to have an example right here to show you. Let's see if I can show you this well. See, it's got a top like this, and then you see these spots along here, these kind of divots along the sides. This is how they made obsidian blades. They'd make that flat part there, and then they'd use a hammerstone and just whack, and they'd whack a blade off here. And then they'd turn it, whack another blade off here, and so on. So you could get, out of one nodule of obsidian properly prepared, you could get hundreds of knives off. So this is the way they do it. By the way, I don't normally have artifacts. Somebody sent me this in the mail, and well, I didn't want to throw it in the trash. So today, it's a teaching tool. Great. So that was a really interesting connection. I never thought that they were using obsidian, much less that they were making it in the same way as the Maya. I walked into the museum in Thebes, and in the cases were obsidian cores, just like this. Point number 4 between the Maya and the Greeks is this formation of city-states. A lot of other places were a unified empire with a capital, but these two cultures, the Maya and the Greeks, they were always city-states. And those city-states had no central capital. They had allies and enemies amongst them. Now, a big difference between the two is how they formed those alliances. In the Maya world, we see again and again that intermarriage between royal families bonds two cities together. But in the Greek world, that was actually strictly forbidden. Someone from Athens could not just go over and marry the royalty of, say, Sparta. That would mess everything up. There were some slight exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, the Greeks did not allow marriage to be part of their alliance strategy, where the Maya, it was their strategy from the beginning. Now, I should qualify that when Alexander the Great came to power in the 3rd century BCE, he actually briefly unified all of Greece under his rule. For that matter, all of Egypt. He went all the way to India. But the second that he died, the entire area fragmented again into city-states. And that brings me to point number 5, which is that both civilizations were ultimately conquered by empires. It seems that in some ways their city-state model was literally an Achilles heel. In the case of the Greeks, obviously, it was the Romans who took them out. For the Maya, ultimately they were taken out by the Spanish, but the Aztecs were in the process of taking them over as the Spanish arrived. So the Aztec Empire had already spread from its capital city, which is now Mexico City, used to be called Tenochtitlan. They had already spread through Oaxaca down into the highlands, and they had conquered the highland Maya. And archaeological evidence shows us that they were preparing a siege of the Yucatan. Once they had the Yucatan and the highlands, they had pretty much taken over Maya society. So in both cases, these beautiful art-filled civilizations, because they were both city-states, that led to their ultimate conquering and demise. If you like what I do, please consider supporting me through Patreon. YouTube's ad revenue model sucks. You have to put up with clicking through weird commercials, and creators always get a pittance of the actual revenue. So let's not do that. Patreon is really a much more direct way to support the kind of content that you value. For just $5 a month, you can keep me in this chair instead of out there trying to make a living some other way. I am as cheap as a cup of coffee and considerably less bitter. My Patreon is actually linked to my podcast, ArchaeoEd, which if you haven't heard that, you might like that too. But here's the link right here to my Patreon through ArchaeoEd. I'll also put it in my show notes. Thanks for watching. If you liked that, you might like these other 2 videos. Give them a try.